966.
We are pleased to welcome onto the 966 Dr. Badr Al-Saif, founding president at Al-Saif Consulting and assistant professor at Kuwait University, a visiting researcher at Georgetown University, where he completed his PhD in history. Badr is also a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. Dr. Badr, welcome to the 966.
Thank you, Lucien. Happy to be here.
Hi, Badr. How are you doing? It's great to have you. We talked about this for a little bit, about getting you on the show. And
we did. I'm glad we made it happen.
Well, we're excited because we like to feature a lot of different folks on the 966. We especially like to feature young scholars from the region, which you certainly are. But I'll foreshadow. Really, Badr posted really a terrific thread on Twitter, now X, back in early June, just about Saudi Arabia in general. It was really rich, had a lot of good thoughts and insights. And I reached out to him and said, hey, let's talk about this in 966. So we're going to do that. But before we do that, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Your academic pedigree is incredible. I mean, you know, obviously you got your doctorate from Georgetown in philosophy, but you also have a master's degree from Harvard in education and theology. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey?
Look, none of this was planned. Sometimes when I look back, I think I was meant to live in the age of the Renaissance probably, or have some family like the Medicis sponsor me, and then I just go off with my own educational pursuits. It was inquiry just guided my search, guided my path, my educational path. I started at Boston College with politics and history. And from there on, the plan was if you're good in grades, you either go into medical school or law school. So the plan for me was to go into law school. But my home country, Kuwait, didn't accept US law schools as equivalent to a law degree at the time. They do right now. So I had to let go of that dream of doing a law school in the US. Although I got into Columbia, but that didn't happen. So I ended up doing law in London. I went to SOAS. And after that experience, I did work a bit in the law field, in the legal field, and it didn't excite me as much. I mean, you get your facts right, your writing standardized, your thinking and logic sharpened, but it felt, kind of tedious to me. So I had some passion for understanding how people are driven, what their behaviors move them around with. And religion was always center to that understanding, whether I was in the US back in the day when I was a student or living in the Middle East and across the world. I mean, my dad was in the diplomatic corps. So, I saw the Harvard Divinity School offering for theology, and I'm like, you know what, let me check it out. And to the surprise of many, let me tell you, back in the time, they were like, what are you going to do with a theology degree? Are you going to be an imam in a masjid? That's not going to work. So I ignored all of that. I went in, I loved it. I focused on Judaism, Christianity, Islam. It was great. I looked at the texts, I looked at different theologies, the way that they've evolved. And during my work, actually, in Harvard Divinity, I worked on religious education. And I looked at Saudi textbooks, by the way. So Saudi is a recurring theme here. And when my professors saw how I've done all this work from a theological perspective, they actually offered me to apply to the education school and that they would sponsor me, like in a financial aid kind of thing, if I get in, obviously, which I did. And that's what took me to education, which I equally enjoyed, by the way. So when I finished all of this, I went back because, I'm only a Kuwaiti citizen. I don't have a US passport. So I went back to Kuwait, and guess what? I couldn't find anything that specifically met the demands of my fields. So I joined the oil and gas sector. and everyone was shocked that I did that to myself, but I felt, Kuwait and the Gulf is oil rich. This is a conversation or a space that I'd like to be conversant in. So I went in, I worked in Agility, which has various branches in the US. It's a multinational now. I started only as a manager. They told me I can be in the M&A team, the legal team, but I chose oil and gas. And the plan was always, I'll do this for a couple of years, save up some money and then start my own boutique consultancy shop. I surprised myself. Instead of doing a year or two, I stayed for a couple of years. I was getting promoted. I didn't know that I would do well with business and money, which is, good to know. So I left after 5 years, around 5 years, as senior vice president of the oil and gas sector. So I led the team that I joined as its junior member. And by the way, I was the only Kuwaiti at that level of a senior VP. The others were either Arabs or Americans. I started my own consultancy at the time, and then I joined ranks with the Tony Blair Group of the UK. They were doing some development gigs across the Gulf. Our government took notice of me. They asked me to join in. I did, as a deputy chief of staff to the prime minister at the time. I did that for 2 years. And then, the whole education thing about being in academia, about being a professor, has always been in the back of my mind. So I decided to stop shop when it comes to work and then move on with the education component. And I finished my PhD in history, actually, to PhD in history. And I returned to Kuwait University, and now I'm combining both worlds, the consulting and the educational. So that's me in a few sentences.
That's extraordinary. That really is. And I guess pursuing your love and your passions has gotten you to a very interesting place. So you're as you say, you're a Renaissance man.
I'd like to think of myself as one. I hope so. I mean, our breed is going extinct. Think of the opportunities that would happen to people who pursue their passion. And I say this to my students in Kuwait University, and I say to everyone, do not go for any type of pressure. Don't let any pressure push you. Pursue what you love, and you'll find your way through. Things will come up together. I wouldn't have thought, that I would pursue that journey that I did, but, I just did. I let go, and it came about this way.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, and thankfully, I brought you here today with us on the 966. And you have been commenting more, it seems, on the region, politics, diplomacy, a variety of issues. And so let's turn to this Twitter thread. And it sounds light, but it really isn't. You were talking about his conversations about Saudi Arabia's diplomatic steps, Vision 2030, a whole number of things. And you laid out a number of really interesting thoughts. So we're going to, like I said, you've made it very easy. I'm really going to just sort of read some of it, the opening line to your thoughts and let you go with it. So specifically with regard to Vision 2030, you stated Saudi Arabia has gone through several waves of hyperdevelopment, social transformations, and power projection. This current wave fits into this long series, even if it's outpacing itself! ! Can you elaborate on that?
Let me start. I mean, thanks for allowing me the space and time to elaborate. Twitter has its limitations, and if you can't fit it into 140 characters, then you get stuck. Let me start with the whole positionality of things. I am from the region. I come from the region, and I enjoy the attention that the region has had, it has always had, previous decades. But that attention has to be coupled with a genuine interest in the region. And by genuine, I mean knowing the region inside out, trying to skim through developments through one's own positioning and lens will not do it. So for example, if I'm a Chinese analyst living in China and having China guide my interests or my way of looking at things when looking into the Gulf region or juxtaposing it on the region, same thing with the American field. That sometimes curtails one's understanding of the region as is. And that exchange between people from the region with people from other regions is very healthy. And those different viewpoints are needed. But sometimes I feel that the viewpoints from the region are eclipsed. They're not taken seriously. We're reduced to, those persons who are filthy rich, that stereotype that comes across, who are not aware of global dynamics. They're not citizens of the world. They need to be coached sometimes. Again, it's not across the board, but you see this a lot. And a lot of the coverage, specifically on Saudi Arabia, fits into that mold, unfortunately. It's very mesmerized in the moment. So when they try to analyze Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, you name it, they look at it with a presentist lens, which is always healthy. But the historian in me, and I think any sound policymaker, needs to factor in that what you see today in 2023 is always a cumulative process of learning, of development, of generational change. So to look at events in isolation is not a helpful lens. So that's the rationale for putting out this thread. Many have been raising their eyebrows in terms of, oh, Saudi this, Saudi that. This is unprecedented. This is new. This is transformative. This has happened in various ways in the past. So let me go to the thread. Like you said, I mean, from the get-go, we're now, let's stick to the 20th century. I'm not going to go. I mean, we're talking the third Saudi state. If I go to the first and second, we'll spend a few hours.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll not go there.
Although I think it would be fascinating. So we maybe offline. I mean, it would be very fascinating. But anyway, please.
Sure. So the third Saudi state was founded in 1932. So we celebrated close to 90 years last September. Right after its founding, and by founding, I mean the reunification of various parts of the Arabian Peninsula. Such a reunification, when put across history, is a major achievement because it's been centuries since that unification has been in place. And why is that a positive development? It reduces conflict. It reduces a lot of the strife that was going on over resources at the time. As you know, one of the poorest spaces in the world at the time. Mm-hmm. So come 1932, the announcement of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. A year later, the Saudis agree on a concession agreement with the Southern California Oil Company, SoCal. And they create a subsidiary, the California Arabian Oil Company, I think. And they go ahead and they find oil in 1938. So it's not the process of finding the oil, or, by the way, the development of the Trans-Arabian Pipeline, the TAP line, which at the time in 1950, when it was completed, it was the longest pipeline in the world. And it connected the Gulf to the Mediterranean. So why do I mention these developments? Those were not done without Saudi hands, without Saudi minds, without the sweat and tears of people on the ground. So to try to make it an abstract exercise in which Americans came in, they did everything on their own, they brought in their own people, that's too reductionist. And that wasn't the case. So the amount of development that took place and the amount of agency that Saudis had in their hands, and by agency, I mean sometimes they were not happy with their salaries, sometimes they protested the company, sometimes they stood up for their own rights and they sometimes won, sometimes they did not. All of that helped develop a Saudi citizenry. So to me, that's a very major wave that doesn't get talked about when speaking about Saudi today. A second wave, and I'm trying to go chronological, I think the thread goes into the 1950s and 60s. And let me pause because, again, this whole women's empowerment discourse that we hear today, and they think it's born out of the moment. There was a long history and legacy and fights, to get this through. Women didn't have the right to education. The first school came in 1965. And that took a lot of, exercising, a lot of massaging with the religious clerical authority who did not see that this is something that's fit, but the leadership went ahead with it. And, the rest is history. It's developed ever since. The abolishment of slavery happened in 1962, only within 30 years of establishing the kingdom. And again, to try to compare it to the US scene or to other places would be a bit misguided because the legacy of history is different, of slavery is different in the region, and they moved on. Now, mind you, we have issues like everywhere else. I mean, you guys in the US with Mexico, and we have migrant workers. So it's not to say that the issues do not exist today, but the whole notion of trying to move ahead trying to progress. That has always been there. And that's also another major shift. A third one, let me throw in that as well. In 1960, I think women's education was 1960, by the way. Let me correct myself. Women's education was 60, abolishment of slavery 62, and the 65 date was the introduction of television. Because even then, there was a lot of objection to bringing in technology. Some felt that this was copying the West. Some felt that this was something that would corrupt the society. But the leadership and the elites around the leadership pushed their way forward. There's a funny anecdote on that end, and I don't know how accurate it is. But when they went ahead to the king at the time, King Faisal, to try and, dissuade him from going ahead with his decisions, he asked his guards to move away their cars. So when they leave the palace, they have no cars to leave with. So they went down and they're like, where are our cars? They came up and then he told them, okay, if you do not want any technology, then we should also let go of the cars that brought you into here. So you see the given back and forth, the back and forth that goes into developing society. Aramco is another situation. We're talking from a joint venture to the Saudis eventually buying into the company in 1973, a 25% stake. Right after the war in 74, they increased it to 60%. And in 1980, they nationalized the whole industry. Do you know that Aramco's headquarters was in New York until 1952? It just moved to Saudi in 52. So all of these small steps come with a lot of processes, a lot of learning curves, a lot of developments. Aramco today is listed, as you know. There is that movement now to green energy, to green hydrogen, to clean energy. So there's always that motion of progress. So again, the whole theme of trying to stick us into one space, one spot would be inaccurate. And let me end this whole waves with the last wave that I saw happening or unfolding in front of us is what I term with the early 2000s. And that's the social liberalization agenda that the late King Abdullah and the governments then pushed forward. Some people, and again, I'm thinking American, think that this only happened because of US pressure due to 9/11 and all the things that came about. But let me remind you, the Saudis had the Khubar bombings in 2003. They had a lot of terrorist attacks. So they had their own local incentives to also modify the religious discourse, to open up. They had a series of national dialogues in 2003, 2004, 2005. They were thematic. One was about women, one was about religion, one was about society and youth. So all of this, coupled with a signature scholarship program that started in 2005, that sent thousands of Saudis abroad, really opened up and shook society from within and through coming from the outside. So all of this led to the moment that we're in now. It can't be seen as a spur of the moment, emotional kind of reaction that the leadership and people and society have pushed forward towards.
Just a wonderful recap. And I think something that Lucia and I are probably familiar with, but you have to be deep in the weeds to really get that sense. And I couldn't agree more about trying to get the view from the region. And you referenced two leaders, King Faisal and King Abdullah, both of whom actually were known to be very traditional, very close to the clerical class, but also were amazingly progressive in their own way, and in a way that was organic and authentic to Saudi Arabia. Speaking to what you're talking about, that these changes were ongoing, they were achieved, and progress was achieved, but in a way that's consistent with the society and what the society wants to see. So you bring us up to modern day, and in your second point in your thread is you specifically say King Salman and Mohammed bin Salman are operating from an existing manual. And you quote, they fine-tune the interplay between domestic, regional, and global elements. So again, it's building on this wonderful primer on Saudi social change and historical themes. how have King Salman and Mohammed bin Salman built on this sort of playbook?
So let's go to King Salman, because I think he tends to be uh, not credited as much to much of the changes here. And I think we always have to start with King Salman. He has been a main pillar of Saudi state building since his rise as the Prince of Riyadh back in the day. And we're talking over 5 decades. And he has the persona, the drive, the character to drive major change forward. If you ask anyone in Saudi Arabia from the Al Sauds or others who have dealt with him, know that his firmness and perseverance in achieving the goals is something that's, admirable. That's something that people look up to when they're moving forward on. And that's what pushed or opened the space for MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, to move forward. None of these achievements can go in that pace and push without the blessing and the knowledge and the push of King Salman himself. And when I talk about a manual, I'm talking about the delicate balance. Saudi is touted as, we covered the whole sleeping giant thing that I hate, when people cover. So it's neither sleeping nor it doesn't see itself as a giant. It's always in that progress mode. They want to develop better. How can we perfect ourselves and our systems? So that's cleared. Now, when we go to the manual, they'll always have an eye towards 3 layers: the domestic scene, the regional scene, and the global scene. And there are so many different examples that you can think of in which policies were tweaked to cater to those 3 different layers. And again, to think that it's a one-man show, this is sexy. It's easy to spill this out, but it's not. There is more nuance. Look at the detour that happened with moving from the rift and its implications with Qatar to then the embrace. No one does this if they don't have a pragmatic outlook. And this is the pragmatism that you need to develop a nation. You can't be stuck to an ideology of the sort, or else you're going to end up in, lost in history, like some of our neighbors are, unfortunately. And here I'm thinking Iran, and hopefully maybe we cover it later, but this is something that they can work on. Now, that's one example from the foreign policy toolkit. Let me give you another example. Remember how they shifted the VAT, or they cut off certain subsidies? The subsidies were returned in a year's time during COVID when there was a need. And there is that promise that the 15% would go back down to 5% when the need arises. So there is a system in place that looks at the different elements in society. The same thing goes with the women's role. So now we've developed different universities that cater to women, and they're pushing them beyond what they're used to. We saw a woman join the space a few weeks ago or a few months ago. So how does this push a certain limit on society's understanding of itself? Taking certain symbolic moves of that sort have a long way to go to push a certain message through. So sometimes these movements are done with an eye to changing societal understandings. And it's hard, let me tell you. I don't know how they do it, and I'm sure there are many hiccups along the way, and things can be better, but it's hard to manage change. And it's hard to be in that pressure, whether it's self-imposed or not, it can go either way, of being the leader of the region. Because Saudi, talk to the enemies or the friends of Saudi Arabia, they'll both concede to that reality. And that reality is not only based on the symbolism of Mecca and Medina, which is, again, a tried, tired metaphor, if you may, but numbers back this up.
Mm-hmm.
It's the biggest economy, the biggest labor force. They are more and more acting that role out. And this is what the region benefits from. Because let me tell you, whenever there's a major initiative, you'll always notice the GCC and the other party. So the Saudis don't go at it alone. They think of the conglomerate as well. Here, I'm thinking, for example, the latest meeting with the Central Asian nations. That was not done with Saudi alone. The GCC was brought in. the China Arab summit that happened, the America Islamic summit that happened during the Trump years, and so on. So they're trying to live onto that role. They have a mission to be part of this world and to try to infect a positive change. I mean, again, who would have thought Zelensky of Ukraine would be invited to an Arab League meeting along with Bashar al-Assad, and that both would attend in the same room? I mean, who does this? It takes boldness. It takes creativity. It takes trying to please or adapt to the different worlds out there. Same thing now with the Ukraine, the news. I mean, I don't know if it was confirmed yet or not, but in a few days we have another round of peace talks on Ukraine, which, by the way, the Russians would be more attentive to, given the relationship between Russia and Saudi Arabia, even without their presence. But I think building up to that role will say something about how Saudi now sees itself as part of the globe. It's not only a Middle Eastern power, it's not only a Gulf power, but it wants to rise above that to contribute to global society.
Lucian, boy, I love listening to you. Only Lucian, we're grateful, actually. We have, thousands of subscribers in YouTube and the same with our podcast, and our reach has grown. But way back in the beginning, one of our very first long conversations, when I think Lucian, we had 6 listeners, including my mom and my golden retriever.
And my mom, yeah.
And Noodle, your cat.
And Noodle, my cat, yeah.
Was exactly this, the overlooked role of King Salman and his unique, pivotal, just extraordinarily pivotal role in Saudi history and what he's done. But I agree with you 100%. So you're talking about waves. You're talking about, but you also acknowledge that keeping up with KSA is not only tough for non-Saudis, but Saudis also, because this current wave is trying to deliver results faster than ever before.
It's on fire. Let me give you an example. Let me give you examples from my visits to Saudi Arabia, and I go there often. I have an extended family. Al-Saif crosses over to Saudi Arabia. We are a small branch that migrated to Kuwait. Let me tell you. I mean, where can I start? From the smiling faces in the Riyadh airport, the welcoming hospitality that you get hit by once you arrive into the airport, to being picked up by a woman Uber driver in Riyadh. I never had this in the States, let alone in Riyadh. And I converse with her and I'm like, are you fine doing this? Is this your job? She's like, no, I have a marketing job daytime, but I do this on the side. And I'm like, does anyone even bother you? She's like, no, with that new anti-harassment law and with the numbers are registered and everything, no one dares to going to Jeddah and Medina to see female tour guides trying to explain their city to the world, to people visiting them. Examples are limitless. And these are just things that me as a Gulf citizen, I'm not used to. We don't see this in Kuwait. I mean, a Starbucks barista who cleans my table before and after, and who is also Saudi. I mean, again, I'm saying this is how it should be, by the way. I'm just saying that this is being normalized as normal action, and that reinforces them being part of this global world order in which people contribute to society, right? And this is what you need. Again, many examples, but I think has always been that rapid change. But what's been happening in the last 8 years, it's gone even further. They have, and that's the beauty of having visions, by the way. Again, Vision 2030 is not the first vision that Saudi Arabia had, nor the region. We've had different visions. It goes back to the days of the 5-year plans, if you remember. The whole, Soviet heydays, and, they followed that model. But I think having a target and rallying people around that target and pushing forward with that target, keeping in mind Saudi Arabia first. And let me comment on sports, because again, another tired concept is the whole sports washing thing. Let me tell you, they could care less about what people think of them abroad. Saudi Arabia, just like the rest of the Gulf, has an obesity and diabetes problem. One way of fixing this is getting people to run, to jog, to have role models in the sports industry. How brilliant. And then to reinforce internal tourism, and not only internal among Saudis and Gulfies, but about people coming from abroad, you bring in branded names. I mean, it's no secret. I mean, that's what people do everywhere, you know, when clubs pick up certain names in other regions. So trying to change the image of a country may be one of their goals, but let me tell you, it's far down the list. And that's why when, I mean, The Guardian or some other newspaper, I forgot the name, they had a culinary contest and they're like food washing or something like that. That's too much. And you know what it does? It's funny, but you know what it does? It makes people in Saudi Arabia feel a bit ticked off and distant from others in the West. There is a gulf that's being built and it's unnecessary. Why should there be such a gulf? Think of Saudis, Gulfies, Kuwaitis, Qataris as normal people. And we are, you know, we have good and bad people. Some policies go well, some don't. There is a certain system in place. I mean, let's not hide our heads behind the bushes. You know, no one denies the absolute monarchy element of this. And they talk about that. But I frankly think that with all these changes, there will be more space for people to express themselves. And I have an article that's going to come out, by the way, either today or tomorrow, that talks, because tomorrow is the anniversary of the invasion of Kuwait. So I have a huge article coming out on how the invasion shaped the Gulf. And I talk about this because Kuwait is known for its open political system. And I think after the liberation in 91, that system found its way across the region in ways that are modified to their own state-society relations. So, for example, in 91 or 92, you had the first Saudi constitution, the Basic Law. You had the Shura Council evolve and develop and accommodate women. You had elections in the municipal council. So there is space that's opening up, but do not expect us to be like the West. That's not the ask. That's not the aspiration, nor is it frankly needed. Each person and society needs to develop to being their own best and to contributing well to society. How that comes through is the society's conversation amongst itself, as long as the dignity of the citizens is enshrined. And this is how people are moving around in the region here. And that's, I think, where the mismatch is, with many coming in from other places and trying to lecture us on how to conduct business. It doesn't work, guys, you know, it's not gonna happen. So, and the way that people in the region look at it is, in the past, we were colonized or we were occupied. So this is kind of, you know, soft imperialism kind of thing. So let's agree on no one lecturing the other, opening up to each other, respecting one another and disagreeing and saying, we do not think this should be done this way. We suggest this way and vice versa. And I think in that debate, we'll come a long way in developing ourselves and societies.
That's a great platform and launching point for the next item in your Twitter thread. And as our listeners can tell, this was quite the Twitter thread. It had a lot of good thoughts in it. So essentially, you say, in terms of foreign policy and diplomatic relations, Saudi Arabia has taken note of a concept brought forth most recently by the Europeans early this year: de-risking. And you sort of referenced this, and the rapprochement with Qatar, and obviously the diplomatic arrangement with Iran. But you know, this is a specific term, de-risking, that you apply to what Saudi Arabia is trying to do.
This is something that I maybe should write more about because it's quite vague at the moment. You know, what caught my attention, Richard, was that it started creeping into certain, you know, policy wonks, we look at statements and we look at Q&As, and I'm like, it's been a couple of months and this whole de-risking concept is popping up right and left. White House statements, G7 communiques, discussions with China. So I did some digging, and because, as students of IR, this wasn't something that clearly came up at the time, and it has origins in financial institutions. So in accordance to, say, for example, the US Treasury or State Department, when they use de-risking, they have a very specific concept, and it's basically avoiding risk. So if there is an issue, you drop it. And this is not what I meant. And I think we should go back to the concept, deconstruct it, and understand it. What does the D in de-risking mean, and what does risking mean? By de-risking, if I can take an hack at it, is we're trying to eliminate or reduce the amount of risk. I think that's when you try to apply it into international relations, that's the way to go. And it came as an interesting foil to decoupling. People were tired with decoupling because it didn't make sense. Mm-hmm. You can't let go of someone. And what I think of is decoupling comes up when you think of China, US relations. I'm like, how can you decouple from China? The US is its biggest trading partner. It's unrealistic. So let's set ideology apart. Let's think of ways to eliminate risk, to further one's interest along the other side. If I win, it doesn't mean the other person has to lose. It's not a zero-sum game. But here, we need to define what elimination is, or reducing risk. And even more importantly, what are the parameters of risk? So those need to be in the conversation. So say, for example, when Saudi Arabia and Iran are talking about their relations and how they want to de-risk it in terms of trying to improve it and not get into a zone in which we see rockets on Aramco facilities or Abu Dhabi's airport, those things need to be meted out per bilateral relationship. So the amount of risk that Saudi Arabia defines for itself will be different than Iran. But then that's the conversation to be had. We sit together, we look at what it's meant, and it's an evolving definition. It will change with administrations, it will change with circumstances, but I think keeping it in mind and laying out those rules very clearly will go a long way. And I'm happy that we are changing our vocabulary, to be honest. I mean, moving from decoupling to de-risking is good. And let me tell you something, and I don't say this in the Twitter thread, I think the time is ripe to even move from de-risking to yet another concept. And that's where I think I'll be writing on something that develops, better relations, clarity of purpose, trying to understand one another. And to its credit, and I say this, the US foreign policy establishment is picking up on this. I think the way that the Biden administration is dealing with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf right now, this year, 2023, is way better than the first 2 years. You can see it in the recurring visits. The more there are visits, the better you understand the other party. We've had on average, and I keep track, a visit or two every single month since March. Those are good. We finally have a US ambassador in Saudi Arabia after years of absence. This happened, I think, late last year. So that's also good. We're having more people-to-people exchanges, students here and there. The opening of visas in Saudi Arabia is a big achievement. You should, if you talk to scholars who are non-Gulf citizens who tried to come in the past, it was a mess. So to their credit, now they're opening up that space. And look, the more exchange with other peoples and nations, the more open you will be. This is something that's, unhidden. It's known. So I encourage that development, and I think it's good. I hope I explained what I meant by de-risking and where we should go from there.
Well, it's interesting, and on this show, we sort of launched about the end of 2021, beginning of 2022, and I asked often, when is the U.S. administration going to update its approach to the region? It needs a revamp. It needs an overhaul. You need new paradigms. And slowly but surely, I think the learning curve has gone up, and they are doing better, which leads us to your next point, which is really interesting. And I'm just going to read it just like you wrote it. The craze over Saudi-Israeli normalization is absurd. It should not come first on the U.S. national security checklist when thinking about the Middle East.
Now, let me tell you, I wrote this one in June, early June,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
and now it's early August, and the craze has gone quadruple, has it?
Crazy.
That's too much. Come on. I mean, look, I lauded the good elements of US foreign policy. The fixation, I mean, look, America should think of its interests first. And I think, again, as a person who keeps visiting the States, who lived here for many years, the conversation has shifted. Let me tell you, I don't remember seeing people questioning Israel and the aid to Israel and the policies of Israel the way that it's been done in the past year. So I think that's a healthy exchange, not only on Israel, I mean, look, on any American partner and ally who they think is not aligning with their own interests. I think, it behooves Americans to be more open about that because their interests as a country should come first. So now, capture this with me. America is moving into an election year very soon. The economy should be the first. I mean, again, the economy has always been the determinant of the election. The way that the US has been fixated on the Saudi Arabia-Israel thing defies the whole national security of America, of Saudi Arabia, and Israel. Look, without Palestinians in the picture, nothing is going to come through. The 3 years of the Abraham Accords have shown exactly that. So we can't hide them from that picture. That could be on the table. I mean, I'm not privy to those private discussions, but seeing how the far-right government in Israel is acting, I mean, they can't even get their own foreign minister to visit Bahrain or the UAE. They keep delaying it because one of their ministers decides, to go on a stroll in the Temple Mount. And this is really insulting to the feelings of millions and millions of Muslims, not only in the Arab world, but across the Islamic world. So those are the things that need to be discussed. And the asks are high, even if what's reported, from the Saudi end. And look, let me tell you, and I was interviewed yesterday on this specific topic. And what I said was, if anything is to be picked up from this, we should laud Saudi policymaking who enabled the Americans, or the administration in particular, to move from framing it in a pariah state mode to now courting it relentlessly in the past few months, as if it's a bride waiting for marriage,
Yes.
So that shift doesn't bode well for the American US foreign policy establishment. They need to think more broadly of what they need, and they need to think of their own goals. To think that that normalization deal will allow them to stop any Chinese-Saudi development in relations, or to place on the security burden on Israel vis-a-vis Iran, that's too much of an ask. So I know that they're exploring it. And, exploring is not bad in itself because it exposes these positions. But I think they need to put things into perspective. Again, going back to Saudi's leadership role, in 2002, in the Arab League in Beirut, Saudi Arabia presented a revolutionary declaration. And I say this because, it shocks me that no one took it seriously from the West or Israel. The API, the Arab Peace Initiative, gave on the table Israel full normalization with 22 Arab states overnight if it grants the occupied lands that it occupied in 1967 back to Palestine, with East Jerusalem as its capital. And by East, we're talking about a divided Jerusalem where both states can claim parts of Jerusalem as their own capital. What's the rocket science in all of this? Why aren't they doing this? So, that just, is a shocker to me, even to now. I mean, it only speaks of them trying to push themselves through. The Israelis feel that they're protected by America, and that's where the Americans hopefully reassess their position and push the Israelis further.
Yes, I'm with you 100%. The U.S. needs to focus on its national interests and not really carry the water for Israel in this. And, one reason the Arab, Abdullah, but the Arab peace proposal is ignored is because it would require Israeli concessions. And they seem very intent on trying to get something without giving up anything. And, we can't really be party to that. And I would say, I mentioned earlier that we like to feature young scholars from the region. Dr. Abdulaziz Al-Ghashaian is just recently wrote a very good piece on the Saudi Arabia and its perspective on the normalization discussion in Arab Gulf states in Washington. And so we'll be looking forward to any of your comments on this. I'm really curious because you're deeply immersed and conversant and expert on Saudi issues, but you're Kuwaiti. What are perspectives, if you can share that, what are perspectives of fellow Gulf citizens of the Gulf of Saudi Arabia, the Kuwaitis, Emiratis? Obviously, they're going to be different in each one, but in general. And I was struck. I think Lucia and I were both struck. At the World Cup in Doha, it really came through the affinity and the support of regional actors for other regional actors. Everyone got behind the Saudi team. Everyone got behind, regional teams. And they were happy to do it because there was a real affinity and support, even though there might be tensions and policy disputes and that sort of thing. But what is the perspective of Saudi Arabia in the region?
Let me tell you, relations between the different Gulf states predate the Gulf Cooperation Council, which was established in 81. Ties, we have ties of blood, kinship, language, customs, religion, common history. There's so much that's shared that cannot just be ignored. And to reinforce all of this, Richard, we have families across the region that are tied to one another because of the migrations that took place. I'm a living example. I mean, Al-Saif there is a small branch in Kuwait, but the larger family resides in Kuwait. I can think of the same between Saudi and Bahrain, Saudi and Qatar, and so on. So people always look at us and look, oh, they're disputing again, they're going into a rift. That's normal. I think it's healthy. When you have a disagreement, it needs to be out there. Sometimes the framing is too accelerated for people to digest it. But I think, look, this is the name of the game. So either pick up the way we do things or, you'll be lost in translation. It's normal for differences to arise. It's normal for disruptions to happen. It's normal to go back to the fold. And again, I'm thinking now today, the latest is when people talk about the UAE-Saudi dispute. And they frame it in ways in which they're going to go and kill one another. That's not going to happen. Come on. There are shared interests and there are differences on various files. The UAE normalized, Saudi didn't. The UAE and Saudi have different visions of Yemen. They have different visions of OPEC, but that doesn't dissuade them from working on mitigating those differences or managing them. And I think that's how we operate. Saudi, the label that comes across and that pops in mind, given its stature, is always seen as a big brother across the Gulf. And if you look at the archives, they're quite telling. The exchanges that happen between the different leaders and the British, and I'm thinking the British archives there, you'll see that image comes across. It's an old established image. And they are living up to that image. Again, who brings in all the Gulf states together to meet up with the Chinese or with the Central Asians, or now leading through with the Arab League for this year? It's a rotation, as you know. So that's something that we need to work further on. We need to develop that Gulfiness, if you may. We need to think out loud of what makes a responsible Khaliji citizen and how that Khaliji citizen can rise up and contribute to the whole of the Gulf. We are still stuck in our bounded states somehow. And I think the transnational needs to also be balanced off with the national. And there is merit to such an approach, such a mixed approach. We have done a lot through the GCC, let me tell you. The United Customs Union, the Shared Peninsula Military Force, the way, again, since it's August 2nd tomorrow, so it's the 33rd anniversary of the invasion of Iraq to Kuwait. The way that the solidarity that translated when a crisis came through, Those are things that we want to develop further. And don't forget, the Arab Gulf is leading the Arab world today. This has not happened in recent Arab history. This has been the results of a lot of work. Some people say, oh yeah, because Egypt and Iraq and Syria, the usual, traditional leaders of the region are mired in wars and problems. Yes, that's part of it. But look, if you look at the numbers again, we're the biggest contributors to the economy. We have the best ranked universities. We have the biggest and best publishing houses. So there is more than just oil. It's what's been used, how oil has been used to invest back in the people of the region. I think that's the story, and that's how the countries of the region want to move forward. Each has his own formula, understandably, but then how can we align those formulas to achieve a stature for the Gulf that goes beyond the Middle East?
We have the Al-Saifs in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and now there's an Al-Saif in the Jordanian royal family as well.
Indeed.
Dr. Badr Al-Saif, founding president at Al-Saif Consulting, assistant professor at Kuwait University. Too long to read your whole CV here and the readout, Dr. Badr, but this was a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for your time and valuable insights.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being with you.